Our last speaker before we start the Q&A session is Andrew Spiegel. And most appropriately, we're going to wrap up the prepared remarks with an emphasis on the patient perspective, right? Nothing about the Medicare program or any other policies that we work on make any difference unless we are thinking first and foremost about the interests of the patients. Andrew Spiegel serves with the Global Colon Cancer Association. He has spent over 20 years in patient advocacy. He co-founded the Colon Cancer Association in the late 1990s, and he, which is a US-based advocacy group for colon cancer. He also co-founded the Global Colon Cancer Association, which is an international patient advocacy organization representing patients and colorectal cancer groups worldwide. In addition, he has chaired the fundraising committee for the International Alliance of Patient Organizations and co-founded a group called the World Patients Alliance, which is the largest patient organization worldwide. It is my pleasure to introduce Mr. Spiegel.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to this panel. It's been a really interesting panel for me. I learned a lot about the history, which I hadn't heard before, about how Medicare Part D came to be and how all of these issues we're talking about today were talked about decades ago. I'm here to talk as the CEO of the Global Colon Cancer Association, and we are an umbrella organization of all colorectal cancer groups on the planet. By way of background, the rate of colon cancer in America for people under the age of 55 has nearly doubled since the 90s. And in fact, the data shows that in the next 7 years, colorectal cancer in the age group of 20 to 49 will be the leading cause of cancer death. And worldwide, colon cancer is about to overtake lung cancer as the leading cause of cancer death all around the world. And so this is, while many cancers are decreasing in incidence, colorectal cancer is increasing. And I've been involved in this space since really the late 1990s, when there was literally one drug for colorectal cancer. It was called 5-FU. It was highly ineffective. And essentially, if you were diagnosed with metastatic colorectal cancer in the 90s or early 2000s, it was a death sentence, and you generally died within a year. Fast forward now, we have over 30 FDA-approved drugs for colorectal cancer. And as a result, we see that people are living much longer, and we're actually using the word cure for the first time in the colorectal cancer space. And we know that things are going great now for the colorectal cancer patients because of investments that were made decades ago, made in the 90s, 80s, and early 2000s. Those investments have resulted in the drugs being released over the last decade and a half that have really made a difference in the lives of colorectal cancer patients and all cancer patients. We've seen incredible improvements in cancer care over the last decade with the introduction of the new targeted therapies and the immunotherapies and things of that nature. And what worries me so much about the Inflation Reduction Act is that you're going to take away the incentives for all of these drugs to be continued to be developed. And we know that there's two types of drugs that are critical to cancer treatment, and they are small molecule drugs and large molecule drugs, biologics and biosimilars. And I'll tell you a quick personal story about the small molecule drugs. My 47-year-old never smoking wife was diagnosed with metastatic lung cancer 3 years ago. And they knew right away that there was some mutation that must have happened because she is not the type that should get lung cancer. She never smoked, had no high risk factors. It didn't run in her family. And they were right. The doctors were right. She does have a rare mutation. But the good thing about that very rare mutation is that there were new drugs that had just come to market when she was diagnosed. And they're pills. They're called TKIs. They're small molecule pills. And my wife was able to be on one of those pills for more than a year, which had zero side effects. She lived a perfectly normal life. And despite the fact that the cancer had spread to her spine, to both lungs, to her hip, to her pelvis, it was a bad case. She had a complete response to taking a small molecule pill that had just been released. Fast forward a bit, that pill stopped working as they expected it would, and she went on almost 2 years of chemotherapy. And that chemotherapy also worked for the cancer, but it also caused significant side effects. And those significant side effects started to cause her to have early stage kidney failure. And that kidney failure was causing all types of side effects to her body. The chemo was causing incredible side effects. And the long story short is that she's now on a phase 1 clinical trial at Memorial Sloan Kettering for another one of these small molecule pills that not only has it put all of her cancer back at bay, but again, she has no side effects at all. Her kidneys are back to normal. So, let me tell you from not only my 20-some years of patient advocacy, but my personal experience over the last 3 years we need these innovative drugs to come out for cancer patients. My wife's doing great, working full-time. She's in the kitchen right now taking care of our kids and taking care of the house with stage 4 cancer that doesn't exist in her body right now because of these small molecule pills and because of the innovation that has happened over the last 20 years. So we know about the small molecule penalty. This really worries me because these new drugs that are targeted, personalized cancer drugs are small molecule drugs. And that's what works best in people's bodies, that there's literally no side effects whatsoever on this clinical trial that she's on. And we know about the Inflation Reduction Act making these drugs eligible for price controls 9 years after FDA approval, which is 4 years sooner than biologics. And I feel like those 4 years are critical for the industry that are investing in these drugs being developed. And we know that it's already over $1 billion and over a decade to bring new drugs to market. We know that most of them fail and there's great losses that come with those failures. I'm not in the business of talking about drug pricing or pharmaceutical profits or things like that. But what I know is that we need these drugs to be developed. We need to properly incentivize the manufacturers to develop the drugs because the patients need them. And it seems like we've been making incredible progress over the last couple of decades because of the investment in new drugs and new therapies. And why would we ever want to go back? It really is against the administration's own policy on the cancer moonshot. We've been very vocal advocates, and you can see one of the articles that we wrote here at ASBM, vocal advocates to fix this problem that is now a year old. So we see that the biotech companies, the major pharmaceutical companies, have already raised the alarm. I just attended ASCO in Chicago and met with 26 different pharmaceutical companies. I'm hearing the same thing from every single one of them, is that they really are, even though they're well underway of making these new drugs, they really are reconsidering their future investments in small molecule drugs as well as biological drugs. And so very alarming to the patient community as more and more patient advocates become aware of how this law will affect them. So another issue is the negotiation. It's already been talked about by many other speakers before me, so I won't get too heavily into this or the excise tax, but we know this is not a negotiation. You don't sit down with the U.S. government, the biggest payer for pharmaceuticals, and say, okay, let's go up and back and negotiate a fair price. It's not. We know it's price setting. And what bothers me about price setting is, as our earlier speaker said, when you see in Europe, those countries that have had price setting, we see that there is late access or no access to new innovative medicines. And that can mean a lot for a newly diagnosed cancer patient. I was recently on a panel with the American Cancer Society, and we were talking about this exact issue, about innovation and the importance of not delaying access to newly diagnosed cancer patients. And the American Cancer Society speaker was talking about how a triple negative breast cancer patient, when they're diagnosed, a 2-month delay in getting access to the treatment reduces their risk of surviving the disease by 50%. So you know that in almost all of the European countries, there is more than a 2-month delay. There's more than a 6-month delay in getting access to new treatments. Whereas here in the United States, we know that we're getting access to them almost immediately, within 30 to 60 days normally of when a drug is introduced. And just look at the history of drug development. We looked at Europe used to be the leader in drug development. Go back to the 1970s, and they accounted for the majority of drug development over the world. But since price controls were implemented in Europe, now 60% of new drugs are developed in the United States compared to only 13% in Switzerland, 8% in the UK, 6% in Germany and France. So price controls have really impacted drug development in Europe. And I think that's something that the US can't afford to happen here. And we know these price controls, as I said, have reduced the time to access for treatments for newly diagnosed cancer patients. Look at the data of cancer medicines launched globally over the last decade. More than 96% were available to people in the US. 65% were available to other and developed nations. That developed, not underdeveloped nations. We're talking about Australia, Japan, the UK. These major countries that have price settings, they're only getting 65% of the drugs that are available. And there's even more data out there about the delays in getting access to these drugs. So it's really a big problem when you see price controls coming into markets. Access becomes a huge problem worldwide. We had this one situation in Australia where patients lost access to a drug due to price controls in excess of what was agreed to by the government. So what happened was there were fewer choices, not more choices for patients and physicians. And this is one of the things that's not been talked about too much, is that for this whole system to work, especially with biologics and biosimilars, there must be competition. We know every industry that competition drives down prices. But what I think the IRA has done is that it has reduced competition, because who could compete with the federal government? If I'm a biosimilar manufacturer and I'm about to invest $250 or $300 million in a new biosimilar drug, but my competition is going to be competing against the United States government, who's going to set the price, I have to think twice about whether I want to make that investment in a new biosimilar drug, knowing that the government has already set what the price is that they're going to pay. And what if that's too low for my company to make a profit? That takes away biosimilar competition. That takes away the ability to reduce drug prices. And that really can't be argued with. We know that the biosimilar experience so far in the United States and certainly in Europe is working because of increased competition. The more competition that comes into market, the cheaper the prices get. And that is how you reduce drug prices, not by the government telling you what you're going to pay or what you're going to get paid and keeping others out of the market. So fewer choices for patients, not more choices, is what we will see. It's what was seen in Australia. And one of our members, Bowel Cancer Australia, did a webinar for us, and he says, this is not what we were promised by the government. And so we know colon cancer patients literally had a week's notice, and they lost access to the drug that was working for them when a biosimilar came into market. And that is not a good thing for patients. So really the question comes down to, is the US ready for a European style health outcome? Of the new cancer medicines, 90% are available to the US within the first year of launch. It's usually within the first 2 months of launch. You look at major countries like France, Germany, and the UK, less than half of those drugs are available to cancer patients. And look at the death rates of cancer patients as a result. cancer death rates are 1.6 to 1.8 times higher in Europe than those in the US. And I can tell you, when you look at colon cancer specifically, Europe accounts for 10% of the world's population, accounts for 33% of the world's deaths from colon cancer. So think about that. 33% of the world's colon cancers are in Europe. Only 10% of the world's population is in Europe. So there's something wrong that has to be fixed, and it's not what we want to come to the United States, and we don't want to go back in time when we've come so far. So it is important that the patient community get involved in this issue. I am the only patient advocate on the panel today. It would have been great if we had 6 patient advocates talking about this, but they are getting up to speed. You'll frequently see op-eds now, like the one that is highlighted on the slide that I had run on how drug pricing will ruin our health systems. ASBM has launched a microsite, irapatientsinfo.org, that has all of the information that anyone would want to read to get up to speed on how the IRA will affect access for patients long-term. And my organization actually filed a lawsuit. We joined the National Fusion Center, which represents physicians, and we joined pharma, which represents the industry, and we represent the patient voice. So multi-stakeholder lawsuit brought against the administration for the reasons that have been discussed on this call, because we truly believe that this law will affect future innovation. It will affect drug development, and not in a way that's good for patients. So here are some links. You can take your phones real quickly and snap these QR codes if you want to read first my op-ed. That is a link to the one of the places that picked it up was the Reading Eagle. It's been picked up in multiple states now, but you'll be able to read the op-ed here, which really outlines some good data on why the IRA is bad for patients. You can actually see the lawsuit on the second QR code. If you read that, you can read the lawsuit and read a summary of why this lawsuit was filed and what is happening with it. And then, of course, visit that website I told you about, irapatientinfo.org. That's a microsite put out by the Alliance for Safe Biologic Medicines, and there's a QR code for that as well. With that, I thank you for your attention. And again, thank you to the organizers for inviting me to represent the patient point of view in this whole discussion, and I will turn it back over.
Well, thank you so much, Andy. That's very helpful remarks.